Welcome, everyone. You're watching TYT. I'm your host, Anna Kasparian, and we have a fantastic show ahead for you all today. I'm going to go ahead and just right off the bat plug how awesome our bonus episode for our members is going to be today. We've been covering some fun stories, some personal news, a lot of really great content that we reserve for our members. And today we're going to talk about a wealthy couple in Malibu Beach. They live in a nice house, but the husband sleeps outside in a tent. Why does he do it, and does he like it? We'll give you the details on that and more. But of course, during our main show today, we have a ton of important stories to get to, including one of my favorite stories of the day, because it finally gets to the bottom of why we're seeing so many nurses quit in our for-profit healthcare system. People have used these, mass resignations for their own political agendas, but I think it's important to hear from the nurses ourselves, so we'll get to that in the first hour of the show. In the second hour, we'll talk about how Microsoft has acquired Activision Blizzard, a gaming company that has an incredibly awkward name, but I hope the gamers don't get too upset at me for admitting that. But I think that there are some ramifications to that acquisition, but more importantly, I want to give a voice to the workers over at Activision Blizzard who have experienced some pretty terrible working conditions and some abusive treatment by either their colleagues or management. And we'll also have this insane story about an undercover cop who infiltrated activist groups who were attempting to do something about climate change. He apparently slept with a bunch of the activists and thinks that he is not in any way the bad guy. It is an insane story out of the UK. You do not want to miss it. John Idarola will be joining me for the second hour to help me cover that and more. But as always, just want to encourage you guys to like and share the stream. Let your friends know. Let everyone know what we're doing over here at TYT. Have them watch the show with you. Take out the popcorn, enjoy yourselves, enjoy the ride. And let's do it. Let's get to our first story.
Been called a bitch 1,000 times.
I knocked up whore. Get the F out of his effing room, you effing N-word. I've been bitten,
Choked, punched in the mouth.
I had a guy try to kick me in my stomach while I was pregnant.
That poor nurse at your bedside has probably been through hell.
The individuals you just heard from are America's frontline nurses, individuals who, of course, over the last 2 years, thanks to the coronavirus pandemic, have dealt with an extreme level of abuse by unruly patients, by individuals who feel entitled to anything and everything. But something that seems to be misconstrued in the media is this notion that everything has always been hunky-dory for America's nurses up until COVID. But the reality is, our for-profit hospital model has essentially been a huge problem for our frontline nurses for decades, and the coronavirus pandemic has only compounded the problem. The New York Times put together, in my opinion, an incredible video that speaks to the actual nurses to really get to the heart of this for-profit model and why it has continued to be such a big problem, especially during a pandemic. But again, let me just repeat, pandemic or no pandemic, hospitals were already incredibly understaffed when it came to nurses, and that meant that each nurse had just too many patients in order to provide adequate care. So with that said, with that context, why don't we go to the first video where I think the statements from these nurses really do matter to kind of cut through the nonsense we keep hearing about the media, especially when it comes to how COVID is really the problem here.
The biggest force that's driving nurses away? Greedy hospitals.
I could no longer work in critical care under the conditions I was being forced to work under with poor staffing, and that's when I left.
To maximize profits, American hospitals have been intentionally understaffing nurses for decades, long before the pandemic. What the hospital industry doesn't want you to know is that there's never been more licensed nurses in America. Hospitals just aren't hiring them.
There's not a shortage of nurses. There's just a shortage of nurses willing to work under those conditions.
If you don't have enough nurses, patients will die. They will become sicker and they will die.
If you're in the hospital, your chances of dying go up by 7% for every additional patient your nurse has to care for.
Now, we've been hearing about this nursing shortage. We've been hearing about nurses resigning from the work that they've dedicated their lives to. In fact, a recent survey indicates that about 40% of the nurses who are currently employed are thinking about leaving their profession altogether. And again, it isn't so much about COVID. It's more about the fact that they are given this insane workload with so many patients that they are just simply unable to take care of simultaneously. And there's a very clear reason why hospitals are doing it. Hospitals that run under a for-profit model want to ensure that they maximize what? Maximize profits. So there's no reason to believe that a for-profit hospital would be managed or run any differently than any other corporation, any other for-profit company, where you want to minimize your costs and you want to maximize your profits. And the individuals who usually bear the brunt of that system, the individuals who usually deal with the abuse associated with that system, are the workers. And in this case, we're talking about the nurses. And so this problem was already there, and it was later compounded by COVID. Let's watch.
The system was already broken. COVID has just made it way worse.
In one 12-hour shift, we had 6 patients die under the age of 50. And as quickly as they got those beds cleaned, there was more patients there.
A patient grabbed my hand and he begged me to not let him die. Sorry. And I told him that we would do everything we could within our power. And I felt like I was ready to fall apart, but I couldn't because the patient in the next room needed me.
To understand how the situation became so desperate, you have to remember that hospitals are just like any other business. Staffing takes up about half the budget, so a smaller workforce means bigger profits.
Hospitals use this type of what they call flex staffing. So they flex for just the bare minimum at that hour of the day. And then 3 hours goes by, there's many more patients, and then it's, well, you have this many nurses, you'll have to just make do.
The most annoying thing that was ever said to me in my career by an administrator was, "We know you guys need nurses, but it's not in the budget."
So I think this is an easy story to understand, especially when we see how businesses are run and how that usually ends up hurting labor, which is, of course, the biggest cost associated with any for-profit business. Now, the New York Times does provide some possible solutions. And while I agree that the solutions that they're bringing up could work, I would argue that progressives, leftists tend to have a far better solution. So first, let me tell you what the New York Times is suggesting here. And to be clear, this is an opinion piece written in the New York Times. They specifically give examples of legislation that has passed in states like California that essentially regulates the patients to nurse ratio, or the nurse to patients ratio, to ensure that nurses aren't given so many patients to the point where they're unable to provide adequate care to each patient that they're responsible for. So California luckily succeeded in passing legislation like that. However, this is not something that's being done on a national level. There are other states, including Pennsylvania and Illinois, that currently have pending legislation, and hopefully that legislation passes. I think it's a good short-term solution, and I'll explain why it's a short-term solution in just a moment. There are examples, though, of other states who have attempted to pass similar legislation, similar regulations to make sure that nurses aren't given too many patients. But it turns out that, like with any other for-profit business model, any other industry or private sector where profits are always considered more important than people, you get the corporate interests at play. They get involved, they spend a lot of money, and what do? They defeat those efforts. So here is some more information on that.
But a similar law in Massachusetts failed to pass in 2018, thanks in part to a $25 million campaign by the hospital lobby.
It puts government in charge of deciding how nurses care for patients with the same rigid staffing ratios at every hospital in our state. A one-size-fits-all attempt to override the professional judgment of nurses.
The problem with these ads, they're misleading. Just look at California, where a bill like this did pass. The result, more nurses hired, more nurses staying in their jobs, and better patient outcomes.
So yes, there could be attempts to pass legislation either on a federal level or on a state-by-state basis to ensure that there's a way to mitigate the very clear profit motives that are motivating these for-profit hospitals to be incredibly understaffed. Like, people die as a result of that. So in the very least, state legislatures, the federal government, there should be an effort by the very individuals who were elected to represent our best interests to do something about this, to not only protect us as human beings who deserve adequate care, but also to protect our nurses. I mean, there was a lot of talk, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, about how, oh my God, these frontline workers, these nurses, they're heroes. Why don't we all clap for them as they're walking to work, but then pretend as if everything else is all hunky-dory? No, we need to make sure that these healthcare workers, the individuals who are in fact dealing with the brunt of the pandemic, are treated fairly, that they're in better working conditions, and that they're compensated adequately. And yes, you can do that through legislation. You could do it through regulations. But what tends to happen with regulations, especially in the United States, you have private interests that do the lobbying, that engage in the legalized bribes. And little by little, even after all the hard work is done, even after all that policy is debated and we finally get legislation passed, they'll chip away at it little by little by little with their lobbying, with their legalized bribes. So I would argue that we should just cut to the root of the problem here, which is a privatized healthcare model that does not serve the American people well. It doesn't serve our healthcare professionals well. It doesn't serve us well. And if we continue moving forward with a for-profit model, I have no doubt in my mind that those with a vested interest to profit off of our healthcare system will claw their way back to square one, where nurses are dealing with an insane number of patients, which of course they can't provide adequate care to. That's really the heart of the issue here. Again, COVID certainly compounded it. COVID, for all of the pain and suffering that it's brought forth, has, in my opinion, been an eye-opener for many Americans. I think many people are clear, it's abundantly clear that we have a broken system, especially when it comes to healthcare. We were not prepared for a pandemic, even though we had unlimited resources and could have absolutely been prepared. Having a for-profit, privatized healthcare model put us in a terrible position to respond adequately to the coronavirus pandemic. And yes, if you go to other countries that, let's say, have a single payer healthcare system, they ran into issues as well, especially when you would see COVID surges due to new variants. But they're not having problems when it comes to ensuring that people are tested. They're not having the problems that we've experienced from day one with this pandemic. We see that the system is broken. We see that it doesn't work, and it's time to actually do something about it. Making changes here and there with regulation is not good enough. It might be a good short-term solution, but like I said, regulations can easily be reversed with adequate lobbying by corporate interests. And I have no doubt that that's what would happen here if we do succeed in passing legislation. So I wanted to make sure to give the nurses a voice here because everyone loves to speak for them. And I was really happy to see that the New York Times sat down and put that video together and heard their side of the story. So the next time you hear some right-wingers say that nurses are quitting because of vaccine mandates or some other nonsense talking point to fit whatever narrative they have, don't listen to them. Don't listen to anyone. Just listen to the nurses. Listen to what they're telling you because they're just asking for help. And they absolutely deserve it considering the fact that they've dedicated their entire lives and careers to helping us. All right, well, why don't we move on to our next story? We've got a little bit of a healthcare slant in the first segment today for good reason. Congressional Democrats have decided to joined forces with GOP lawmakers to essentially undermine one of the few good things that was accomplished during the Trump administration: an end to surprise medical billing. Now, the legislation passed under the Trump administration, he signed it into law. It's now being implemented by the Biden administration. And it turns out that these corporate Democrats, who are very well funded by individuals who profit off of surprise medical billing, are essentially trying to interpret the legislation in a way that doesn't really give us the full protection as patients that we deserve. So let me give you the details on how this all went down. This was a great piece written by Austin Allman over at The Intercept. A key provision in the No Surprises Act could become a first step toward allowing the federal government to standardize rates for medical procedures covered under private insurance plans, an objective the private healthcare industry, of course, has fought for decades. That's because it is a for-profit system where they would much rather protect their profits than provide the care necessary to keep people alive, healthy, and safe. Now, providers and insurers will enter forced arbitration if they cannot agree on the price for treatment. Each side will send the arbiter a payment offer, and the arbiter will pick the offer they think is most fair. Arbiters, and this is the part where there's some battle, arbiters must prioritize the median in-network rate when deciding disputes, forcing providers to justify any departure from their typical rates. The rule effectively stops them from price gouging consumers who are out of network. So let me give you guys more context on this. We've talked about it on the show before, but just as a reminder, there's been an ongoing problem within our healthcare system where an insured individual goes into a hospital to receive treatment or care. And then as they're in that hospital, while they have absolutely no idea, someone who is out of network, some sort of healthcare provider, a doctor, a nurse, an anesthesiologist, someone who is not covered by their health insurance will provide some portion of that care during that hospital stay or visit. And since that individual is out of network, all of a sudden, the patient gets hit with a surprise medical bill. So this legislation was meant to put a stop to that, to mitigate that. There were caveats in the legislation that were laughable. For instance, if you need to be airlifted to a hospital, this would prevent you from being price gouged by the airlifting ambulance. But if you are given ground transportation by an ambulance, that is not covered by this legislation. I don't know why. It is a weird caveat to it. And I mean, it's the United States Congress. Like, would it be legislation if it didn't have weird loopholes and caveats? But anyway, let me get back to the point of the story. Now, for the most part, this was finally an effort to do something to mitigate surprise medical billing. And it was a bipartisan effort, one of the few things that actually did get done by Congress under the Trump administration. But now, all of a sudden, we're seeing corporate Democrats join forces with the GOP to undermine the very point of the policy to begin with. So last year, in the months leading up to the bill's enactment, opponents filed a flurry of lawsuits claiming that by enforcing the rule in a manner widely viewed as consistent with the text of the legislation, the Biden administration had overstepped Congress's intentions. So the Biden administration is implementing the legislation as it is written. There's an independent arbiter who comes in, and that independent arbiter who resolves the price issue will look at the median cost of the service that the patient is being price gouged for to ensure that the price gouging doesn't happen. These lawmakers, both Democrats and Republicans, are arguing, no, see, that's actually that's gonna drive down the costs a lot more than we want. More importantly, a lot more than our corporate donors want. Let me give you more. The legal arguments, by the way, in these lawsuits rely on murky case law about congressional intent. But there are some nonpartisan experts who have already weighed in on this. They're familiar with the No Surprises Act, and they told The Intercept that the rule is in fact consistent with the legislation's text. I don't know, I mean, did these corporate Democrats read the legislation that they voted for? I mean, what happened? Are they completely in the dark, or are they just playing stupid now? I mean, obviously, my suspicion is that they're intentionally playing stupid to fit whatever needs their corporate donors want. But here's where Congress does come in to try to sabotage this legislation, which is now a law, by the way, passed. A series of letters and statements by members of Congress from both parties, including Senator Bill Cassidy, a Republican from Louisiana, and Senator Maggie Hassan, a Democrat from New Hampshire, and Representative, oh, look at that, Richie Neal from Massachusetts, has nonetheless sought to support filers' claims. The same ridiculous claims that the Biden administration is implementing this law in a way that wasn't intended by Congress, even though he's implementing it exactly how it should be based on the text in the legislation. In a May letter addressed to HHH Secretary Javier Becerra, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, and Labor Secretary Marty Walsh, Senators Hassan and Cassidy, two legislators who actually played major roles in crafting the No Surprises Act, warned the administration against implementing the act's dispute resolution process in a way that favored the median in-network rate. The letter makes an explicit argument for the provider's preferred interpretation of the text. Okay, let's stop right there. But we're gonna bring that graphic back up. The issue here was the price gouging that was carried out by the providers. So would it really make sense to have the arbiter favor what the provider wants to charge? What's the point of the legislation? How stupid is that? But let me continue. Let's put that graphic back up. The letter makes an explicit argument for the provider's preferred interpretation of the text, claiming that legislators, quote, wrote this law with the intent that arbiters give each arbitration factor equal weight and consideration. How about looking at the median cost for the services provided as the best way of determining what a fair price is? That would be a fair way to do it, right? And by the way, we talk about the profit motives for the providers, but there's also an element of private equity greed involved as well. Private equity firms are actually the ones that set up this system where a patient goes to a hospital under the assumption that the patient is going to an in-network hospital and is being treated by in-network nurses and doctors. Private equity firms created the system where an out-of-network provider all of a sudden is in the mix, and that individual, because that individual sees the patient and is not an in-network provider, gets to price gouge. And when they price gouge, who do you think benefits from that? If we're talking about for-profit hospitals and a for-profit model, shareholders are involved, private equity firms are involved, they get to benefit from it as well. This is another case of profits over human lives, profits over people. Now there's more to this, and it's infuriating because Democrats love to pretend like they are always looking out for the little guy. In fact, the very Democratic lawmakers who helped craft this legislation are now the ones who are trying to undermine it. After the Biden administration issued the arbitration rule at the end of September, House Ways and Means Committee Chair Richard Neal and Ranking Member Kevin Brady, a Republican from Texas, sent the administration another letter mirroring the language used by Hassan and Cassidy. Their letter argues that Congress deliberately crafted the law to avoid any one factor, like the median in-network rate, tipping the scales during arbitration. Oh, I mean, God forbid that members of Congress would want to tip the scales in favor of the patient rather than those seeking to profit off of the healthcare system. God forbid. They would never want to do that. I mean, it's incredible because on one hand, yes, they're trying to undermine the very legislation that they crafted in the first place. But more importantly, understand what they're saying in these letters. They're effectively admitting, well, we don't want to tip the scale in favor of the patients. That's not what we were intending to do. When people tell you who they are, believe them. They're telling you exactly who they are. Let's look at this clown next to me, Richie Neal. Anyway, there's more. In November of 2021, a large bipartisan group of House members also sided with providers in the dispute, Representatives Tom Suozzi, a Democrat from New York, Brad Wenstrup, a Republican from Ohio, Raul Ruiz, a Democrat from California, and Larry Bouchon, a Republican from Indiana, led 150 of their colleagues in a letter that claimed to lay out in starkly legalistic terms the congressional intent behind the No Surprises Act, while the letter's signatories, 79 Republicans and 73 Democrats, oh, look at that bipartisanism, how sweet is that, were disproportionately conservative. A few committed progressives like Barbara Lee and Rashida Tlaib also signed. Look, I don't know why they signed. Maybe they were advised in a terrible way and had no idea what they were signing on to. Rashida Tlaib has been a warrior, a fighter when it comes to those who have really suffered the consequences of a privatized model. I'm willing to give her the benefit of the doubt because this is definitely out of step from what I've seen from her. But you gotta fire whoever advised you to vote in favor of, to sign on to this garbage letter. Just keeping it real. Don't put your name on something unless you know what you're putting your name on. Now, the move has the potential to drive down the high prices US providers charge compared to other countries, stoking fears in the healthcare industry that it would lead to standardized rates. Oh my God, God forbid. The drop in prices would at least partially be returned to Americans in the form of lower health insurance premiums. And so the healthcare industry hates that. They hate it. And the very people who are very business interests who are behind this effort to essentially dismantle a good piece of legislation includes the American Hospital Association, the American Medical Association, basically private healthcare industry. They want to be able to price gouge you. They're furious that Congress actually succeeded in doing something on behalf of patients. And now some of the people who actually helped craft that bill in the first place are turning around, apologizing profusely to their dear corporate donors, and essentially trying to make it seem as though Joe Biden is interpreting the law in a way that they didn't intend, even though the text makes it abundantly clear that he's actually carrying it out in the way that it was intended. That's just the fact of the matter. We got to take a break. When we come back, we've got more news, including, yes, details on Trump's alleged fraud when it comes to his assets. He does not want you to know these details. I love it. You're going to love it. Come right back. For everyone who's writing in with super chats, with member comments, just want to thank you guys. I always love hearing your perspectives. Chaplain Fred, AKA Prayer Dragon, wrote in and said, thank you, Anna, for bringing this news up. All of my nurse friends at Northridge Hospital are going on strike again. They're so exhausted and cry every day. Chaplain Fred, I'm going to assume you mean Northridge, California. And if you do, that's exciting. That means that you either live in the area or, I went to school in Northridge. I lived near Northridge, so I love that. But it breaks my heart to know that nurses in Northridge are going through what they're going through. And hopefully by drawing more attention to how broken this healthcare model is, they can get some justice. I love to see that they're striking. They need to take the power back. They deserve way more. All right, well, let's move on to the latest news in regard to Trump's alleged criminal fraud, because we have more details and they're pretty outrageous. So Donald Trump and his children are being called on to testify under oath after New York's Attorney General, Letitia James, released further details in regard to the alleged fraud Trump and his business has engaged in. Now, there was a recent court filing by Letitia James, and the whole point of the court filing was to respond to Trump and his family essentially trying to block any attempts to force them to testify under oath. This is a civil lawsuit. He is also facing a possible possible criminal charges. There's a criminal investigation tied to these fraud allegations as well. But I do want to give you the details outlined in this document because we have more detail in regard to what Trump allegedly inflated in value in order to secure insurance and other benefits for his businesses. He essentially inflated his assets. So the filing outlined what James's office termed misleading statements about the value of at least 6 Trump properties as well as the Trump brand. The properties included golf clubs in Westchester County, New York, and Scotland, flagship buildings such as 40 Wall Street in Manhattan, and Trump's own penthouse home in Trump Tower. Now, this wasn't only to obtain insurance, it's also to obtain loans. One of the ways that you're able to qualify for a loan is by using your assets as collateral. And so the allegation here is that Trump, his family members, his business intentionally lied, intentionally inflated the value of his assets in order to obtain these loans, in order to obtain the insurance. Now, James's filing argued that the company misstated the value of the properties to lenders, insurers, and even the IRS. Many of the statements, the filing argued, were generally inflated as part of a pattern to suggest that Trump's net worth was higher than it otherwise would have appeared. That is, by the way, the most expected thing to come from Donald Trump. I mean, this braggadocious, like constant chest thumping guy. Oh, wow, he was inflating the value of his assets. Wow, that's shocking news. Now, some of the lies that were outlined in this court filing, this legal filing, were pretty outlandish, okay? So the company inflated valuations with $150,000, for instance, $150,000 initiation fees into Trump's golf club in Westchester that it actually never collected. Mansions that had not yet been built on one of his private estates, and 20,000 square feet in his Trump Tower triplex that also did not exist. So he was, if this is proven to be true, he was not only inflating the value of his assets, he was claiming to have assets that didn't even exist yet. And by the way, he would inflate the value of his assets, allegedly, when it came to obtaining loans or insurance. But then he would also, in other cases, deflate the value of his assets. Why would he do that? Well, his own personal former attorney, Michael Cohen, explained why during a 2019 hearing. Let's hear how that all went down.
While the president claimed in financial disclosure forms that Trump National Golf Club in Jupiter, Florida, was worth more than $50 million, he had reported otherwise to local tax authorities that the course was worth, quote, no more than $5 million. Mr. Cohen, do you know whether this specific report is accurate?
It's identical to what he did at Trump National Golf Club at Briarcliff Manor.
Do you know, to your knowledge, was the president interested in reducing his local real estate bills, tax bills?
Yes.
And how did he do that?
What you do is you deflate the value of the asset, and then you put in a request to the tax department for a deduction.
So in other words, he would deflate assets in order to save money on taxes, to basically skirt having to pay taxes. So tax fraud, if that is something he's being investigated for and it's found to be true, that's a serious crime that all of us would spend time in prison for. Then there's the issue that Letitia James has outlined in this latest court filing, showing that he had intentionally inflated assets. And if he did do that, that is fraud with the intention to obtain loans and insurance. In 2015, for example, while seeking to refinance a loan on his 40 Wall Street tower in Lower Manhattan, Trump's statement of financial condition estimated that the property was worth $735 million. Yet one lender concluded it was worth only $257 million. Wow, that's quite a disparity there. I wonder what explains that. Now, of course, Trump is not open or willing to testify under oath. Neither are his family members. And so Trump is fighting this as hard as he can. There's also some question as in regard to whether or not he's really gonna face serious consequences for this. What Letitia James is pursuing here is a civil lawsuit. This is not a criminal investigation, but to be fair, there is also a criminal investigation tied to these allegations of fraud. In early December, James issued a subpoena for Trump as well as for Donald Trump Jr. and Ivanka Trump, seeking to question them as part of her civil inquiry. James already questioned another one of Trump's sons, Eric Trump, in October of 2020. But guess what? It seems like he had a little bit of a guilty conscience. He invoked his Fifth Amendment right against incriminating himself in response to more than 500 questions, the new court filing said. And so after receiving these subpoenas, that's when Trump and his lawyers decided to file a federal lawsuit against Letitia James. And the argument here is that this is a witch hunt. This is politically motivated, even though it seems as though there is sufficient evidence to move forward with this investigation and possibly any fines or consequences that come along with committing this type of fraud. James's lawyers said that the release of the details would not hamper their investigation, and added that the office was also looking into other content not discussed in this latest filing. And just to give you some more information about the criminal investigation into this matter, James's inquiry is running parallel to a criminal investigation led by the Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, which is examining some of the same conduct. And is it likely that Trump will face any real consequences? Well, I'm a pessimistic person when it comes to people in positions of power, even people who were in positions of power. People like Trump, former presidents, they typically get away with everything, whether it's war crimes, financial crimes, fraud, all sorts of things. So I want to make sure that we don't get too excited or get our hopes up that justice would be served in this case. And also there's one other issue. So a case like this could be hard to prove, as the New York Times writes. Property valuations are often subjective. And Mr. Trump's lawyers are likely to note that his lenders and insurers, sophisticated financial institutions that turned a profit off their relationship with the Trumps, did not rely on the company's estimates. So I'm just not really interested in believing what Trump's lawyers have to say. However, the statement regarding property valuations being subjective, that's definitely true. But how do you also account for the fact that they provided valuations for properties that don't even exist? It's a little bit of a problem. It's like me going to a bank and telling the bank, yo, I need a loan, homie. You give me a loan? Okay, what are you gonna use for collateral? Oh, that $50 million mansion I have. I have a $50 million mansion. That's fraud, you can't do that. And if proven, that's essentially what Trump and his business did. So we'll see how this all plays out. It's amazing how easily they just lie about these kinds of things and usually fail to suffer any consequences for it. All right, we got to take a quick break. When we come back, I'll tell you how the IRS is going after wealthy tax dodgers. No, I'm sorry, not wealthy tax dodgers. IRS is going after your side hustle. Want to make sure they collect taxes on that. We've got that and more when we come back. Welcome back to TYT. There's been a lot of talk about how we need to ensure that everyone is paying their fair share in taxes. And the IRS is really ramping up their efforts to do just that. Except not really. So let me give you the details. If you are earning an extra buck through a side hustle, Maybe you like to refinish furniture and sell it on Etsy. Maybe you're like this artsy, craftsy kind of guy, kind of person, and it's just a fun way to make some money on the side. Well, the IRS is now targeting you to ensure that you pay your taxes. And while this is happening, let's just be abundantly clear that the very individuals who have gotten away with paying almost no taxes, the millionaires and billionaires in this country, will continue to do so because there has not been a passage of a wealth tax. There has not been an increase in the corporate tax. There has not been an increase on any type of tax that would impact the wealthy and privileged. But we do need to make sure that we go after those damn Etsy vendors because they could be making more than $600 a year from their side hustle, and that's unacceptable. Now, starting this month, users selling goods and services through such popular sites as Venmo, Etsy, and Airbnb will begin receiving tax forms if they take a payment of more than $600. The threshold used to be much higher. So apps, marketplaces, and payment providers have long had to report certain payments to the Internal Revenue Service for any user that collected more than 200 transactions that totaled more than $20,000 in value in a given year. So that threshold of $20,000 for your side hustle has now been lowered to $600. So listen, I believe everyone should pay their fair share in taxes. But the fact that the attention right now is being focused on independent vendors on Etsy and Venmo, while the rich still fail to pay their fair share in taxes, is beyond maddening. And by the way, this is also in the context of lawmakers incessantly talking about how much they love and support small businesses. Oh, small businesses, it's the heart of the country. It's the heart of the country. When we're talking about these independent vendors, I mean, you can't get smaller than that. These are literally people who are making extra money through a side hustle, through something creative, something that they can offer in the form of a product. With the case of Airbnb, of course, they're literally renting out their home. Airbnb, I don't have as much, just keeping it real, I don't have as much sympathy for, but really you're gonna target grandma for selling her beautiful beaded necklaces on Etsy? Like that's where you're gonna collect the tax revenue? Let me give you more. Well, this is obviously sparked some outrage on social media sites. In fact, one tax attorney said this: maybe it's a boon to the IRS, but it's not coming from the billionaires, it's coming from the smaller businesses. It's much harder to go after billionaires. It's much harder to go after Amazon. If you have someone who makes a mistake, a small business, it's very easy to go after them. And by the way, this is not the bug, this is the feature. This is very much intentional, and it is the result of GOP lawmakers succeeding in cutting funding to the IRS. Because let's keep it real, it's very easy to go after an independent vendor on Etsy to ensure that that person is paying taxes on whatever they're making. It's a lot harder to do an audit, for instance, on some billionaire who's dodging his or her taxes through a complicated, system, whether it's shell corporations, tax shelters. There's all sorts of complicated stuff. It takes more resources to audit that individual. And so corrupt lawmakers who have been bribed by corporate interests have made sure that the IRS is toothless when it comes to the real tax dodgers in this country. And the real tax dodgers in this country, by the way, have been doing real well during the pandemic. Why don't we take a quick look at this fairly recent headline from Americans for Tax Fairness. US billionaires' wealth surged by 70%, or $2.1 trillion during the pandemic. They are now worth a combined $5 trillion. And when you look at the percentage of their wealth that gets taxed compared to what grandma gets taxed on Etsy, and by the way, I apologize for the stereotype. It's just there's a lot of great vendors that I love on Etsy and they happen to be grandmas. It's maddening. It's maddening to know that right now the focus is on this, on people making a couple $100 on these platforms. And by the way, to add insult to injury, this is what really got me. The new $600 threshold arrived last year as part of the American Rescue Plan, which the White House billed as a way to provide relief to small businesses hit hard by the pandemic. How laughable is that? The lower threshold also comes as more and more Americans bet on themselves. A record 5.4 million adults applied to form their own business last year, according to the US Census Bureau. And I don't blame them. I mean, we obviously have read the stories, we've heard the stories of all these workers who have decided, I'm gonna reprioritize my life, my interests. The Great Resignation occurred, people are leaving their corporate jobs, and they would rather work for themselves. They would rather go after whatever dreams they have, put their creative abilities to use. There's also the case of hairdressers who have decided to leave these salons where they make commission to go work for themselves. They'll do house calls, and the way that they get paid is through Venmo or through PayPal, however they get paid. My point here is we're talking about people who have not really been at this like privileged place in our economic system. In fact, we're talking about people who were really harmed by this pandemic, while the wealthiest people in this country collected another $5 trillion for themselves. I mean, just let that sink in. It just adds insult to injury. And to have this be part of the American Rescue Plan and say that it's all an effort to help small businesses when in reality it's just a way to go after independent vendors on these platforms, it's insulting. And again, couple that with the Biden administration's failure to do anything substantive in ensuring that the rich pay their fair share. How do you look at that administration? How do you look at Congress and really think that they work for you? How do you make an argument that a Democratic administration is really any different substantively from a Republican administration on these types of issues, on economic issues? It's really hard to make that argument. Rhetorically, they might be different. Effectively, substantively, a lot of similarities there. All right, we got a few more minutes in the first hour, and I wanted to end the first hour with a hopeful story. And this is something that was published in Jacobin by Jonathan Michaels, something that I did not know enough about. Wanted to share the info with you. So, as we all know, the healthcare system in the United States is broken. We need a single payer Medicare for all model. There's no question about it. We have nurses quitting in droves because for-profit hospitals are intentionally understaffed in order to maximize profits. We have Americans going bankrupt due to medical emergencies. We have elderly individuals who are in retirement going bankrupt as a result of medical emergencies, losing their homes, losing everything they have. This is not a model that works. However, there's a little glimmer of hope. Within this for-profit healthcare model, there happens to be a public program that has worked really well. And if we can expand it, and if we can inch closer and closer to a single-payer healthcare system, we could be in good shape. Now, we, by the way, might be short as many as 55,000 primary health doctors in the coming decade. So by 2033, the Association of American Medical Colleges estimates that we will be short 55,000 primary care physicians. And part of the reason why is because primary care physicians have to take out a lot of money in loans in order to get their education. And unlike other specialists, for instance, primary care physicians are not compensated as much. They don't make as much money. So it ends up becoming a deterrent for anyone who might consider being a primary care physician. And then here comes Jonathan Michaels over at Jacobin with a program that's already been implemented that could be expanded and could mitigate what we're experiencing right now with a shortage of primary care doctors. In March of 2021, when he signed the American Rescue Plan, President Biden directed $1 billion to a program called the National Health Service Corps. Unfortunately, not many people know about this, even though it's actually been around since 1972. And I will admit, I didn't know nearly enough about this, but it's a successful program that should be expanded. The NHSC commissions medical, nursing, dental, nurse practitioner, and physician assistant students to practice primary care in designated underserved areas, both in rural and urban. So in return, NHSC recipients receive student loan reimbursement or financial assistance to pay for college. Additionally, members of the NHSC are primed to take a leading role in the Medicare for All movement. So think about it. These are people who are interested in becoming primary care physicians. Because of this government, this publicly funded government program, they're able to get their education without taking out massive loans. And then in return, they serve in underserved areas. So it's really a win-win situation, and it shows what our healthcare model really could be if we moved away from this for-profit broken model to something that actually serves all of us, both the individuals who are interested in being doctors and the individuals who need care. So more than half of all NHSC providers serve in a federally qualified health center where patients are seen regardless of their ability to pay. One study by the Kaiser Family Foundation found that federally funded community health centers serve nearly 26 million children and adults, roughly 1 in 12 Americans, in more than 10,400 urban and rural locations. Nearly half of all patients receive Medicaid. In some areas, these health centers are literally the only place people can go to get the health care that they need. Important healthcare procedures, things like vaccinations, by the way, pap smears for women. Again, this is preventative healthcare. It's also very important for our healthcare system to ensure that people are getting the preventative healthcare they need, so they're not ending up in emergency rooms with highly expensive medical conditions that are more difficult to treat. The program not only helps the patients, as I mentioned, it also helps the doctors. So one of the main reasons American medical students do forego careers in primary care is the exorbitant cost of medical school tuition. NYU Medical School eliminated tuition in 2018 in the hope that more students would opt to work in less lucrative areas of medicine like primary care. The NHSC goes a step further by directly placing providers in the communities where they are needed the most, and it doesn't rely on the charity of rich donors. Oh, I love that. It's funded by the public and for the public. You know where they actually use this model, and it's actually it ended up being very successful? In Cuba. In Cuba, they have more doctors and nurses than they know what to do with. In fact, they have so many qualified healthcare professionals that oftentimes what Cuba does, very different from the United States, instead of using war to make everyone else bend to their will, Cuba uses a diplomatic approach by sending its doctors and nurses to various countries around the world to help out when there's a medical emergency, if there's like some sort of outbreak of some sort of virus. It's really interesting stuff. It's great to see not only that it's worked in a place like Cuba where they're obviously under-resourced, but that we have a little sliver of that program here in the United States, and it actually bodes well for both the healthcare professionals and for underserved communities. Now imagine if we could expand this. In fact, imagine if this was our healthcare system, if there wasn't a profit motive, if people were actually placed in, were considered a priority over profits. It's possible. We've seen it succeed in a small way here in the US. Let's expand it to the point where we can finally inch closer to Medicare for all, because I think that's the ultimate goal. If we really want to help people economically, if we want to keep people healthy and alive, that's the only real solution to what continues to be a broken for-profit healthcare model. We got to take a break, but when we come back, everyone's favorite Dragon Daddy will join us. John Iadarola will be here to talk about an insane story involving an undercover cop who engaged in sexual affairs and undermined climate activists for years to come. We've got that story and more when we come back.
Thanks for listening to the full episode of The Young Turks. Support our work, listen ad-free, access members-only bonus content, and more by subscribing to Apple Podcasts at apple.co/TYT. I'm your host, Cenk Uygur, and I'll see you soon.